Have you ever been the golden child at work? The one everyone praised, the one your boss singled out in every meeting, calling you the future of this company. And then, almost overnight, you became invisible, or worse, the target? If you felt that whiplash, you already know what it's like to be built up just so you could be torn down. There's a name for what happened to you. It's called calculated elevation, and it's one of the oldest tools of power ever documented. Today, you'll learn exactly how it works, why it's used, and how to walk out with your mind intact. Before we go further, let's unlock the mind of the man who mapped this pattern 500 years before your boss ever used it. If any part of that felt familiar, just type the word "seen" in the comments right now. Not to prove anything to me, just so you know, as you watch this, that you're not the only one this has happened to. Let's start with the first truth, and it's the one most people never see coming. Praise, when it's calculated, is not a gift. It's a leash. Picture the scene. 3 months into a new role, your manager stops you in the hallway and tells you, in front of 2 other colleagues, that you're the best hire the team has made in years. In the next all-hands meeting, your name comes up twice. Once for a project you led, once as an example of the kind of thinking we need more of. You go home that night feeling seen in a way you haven't felt in years. And that feeling becomes the thing you start working for. Not the salary, not even the project. The feeling. Here's a second version of the same trap. A junior employee is pulled aside by a senior director who tells her, quietly, that she reminds him of himself at her age, sharper than the rest, wasted on the small assignments she's been given. He starts looping her into meetings above her pay grade. She starts staying later, saying yes more, second-guessing him less. Neither of them called it manipulation. It didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like being chosen. That's exactly why it works. Human beings are wired to seek status confirmation from whoever controls their resources: pay, promotion, protection. When that person we depend on singles us out, our brain doesn't file it as strategy. It files it as safety. Evolutionarily, being the favored one in a hierarchy meant more food, more protection, more standing. So when a boss elevates you, some old part of your brain relaxes and says, "I've made it. I'm safe here." That relaxation is exactly the state a strategic superior wants you in, because a relaxed, grateful employee rarely questions, rarely leaves, and rarely says no. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this mechanism 500 years before organizational psychology gave it a name. In The Prince, he writes, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, when of the two, either must be dispensed with." Most people read that line as an argument for cruelty. It isn't. It's an argument about reliability. Machiavelli's point is that love, including professional admiration, praise, favor, is a bond controlled entirely by the person receiving it. Your boss can decide at any moment to stop favoring you, and nothing in the bond itself obligates him to keep favoring you. Fear, cold as it sounds, is at least consistent. Praise is not. And the moment you understand that the praise was always revocable, you stop mistaking it for security. So what do you actually do with this? First, separate the feeling from the fact. Notice when you feel the warm rush of being singled out and name it silently. That's a stimulus, not a status. Second, keep receipts, quite literally. Document your actual contributions in writing, independent of anyone's verbal praise, so your value exists on paper, not just in someone's mood. Third, watch how the praise is delivered. Genuine respect is usually specific and private, focused on the work. Calculated elevation tends to be public and comparative. You're better than the others, because it's not really about you. It's about installing a hierarchy where you owe your position to one person's opinion. Because here's the uncomfortable question this raises, one we'll answer over the next several lessons. If your entire position was built on one person's favor, what happens the moment that favor turns? That's not a hypothetical. That's the next trap. Here's the second truth, and it explains why the fall, when it comes, always feels so sudden. You are never standing on solid ground. You are standing on someone else's decision. Think about the employee who gets fast-tracked purely because a vice president took a liking to him. He skips the slow climb everyone else has to make. He's invited to strategy meetings before he's technically qualified for them. For a while, it looks like the smartest career move in the building. Then the vice president gets reassigned to another division. Overnight, the fast-tracked employee is just a mid-level person nobody else invested in. No one else built a relationship with him because they didn't need to. He had his one sponsor, and that was supposed to be enough. Or consider the marketing lead who was hand-picked by the founder himself, told directly, "You're the only one in this building who really understands my vision." She stopped building alliances across departments because why would she need to? She had the founder. 18 months later, the founder brought in an outside chief operating officer to professionalize the company. And that executive owed her nothing. She discovered too late that being close to power is not the same as having power of your own. Machiavelli devoted real attention to exactly this distinction in The Prince, when he compared princes who rise by the favor of the people to those who rise by the favor of the great. He observed that a prince elevated by the great has a harder time holding his position because he's surrounded by people who consider themselves his equals. People he cannot command the way he can direct those he actually built support among. A position handed to you by one powerful person is fragile in a very specific way. It depends entirely on that person's continued power, continued favor, and continued presence. The moment any one of those three changes, your position changes with it, whether or not you did anything wrong. Why does this trap catch smart people so easily? Because building broad support is slow, and being chosen by someone powerful is fast. Humans are drawn to the shortcut, especially early in a career, especially when validation feels scarce. It also feels disloyal somehow to build relationships outside the person who elevated you, as if diversifying your support system is a betrayal of the one who believed in you first. That feeling is worth examining because it's rarely accidental. People who elevate others as a control strategy often, consciously or not, discourage them from building outside alliances because an employee with independent standing is much harder to discard quietly. So here's what to actually do. Audit your support base honestly. If the person who champions you left tomorrow, who else in the building would vouch for you, unprompted? If the honest answer is no one, that's not proof you're doing something wrong. It's data telling you where to invest next. Second, build lateral relationships deliberately, not out of ambition, but out of insurance. Colleagues and other teams who see your work directly, not through your sponsor's description of it. Third, keep your professional reputation portable. Skills, documented results, and relationships that exist independent of any one office or org chart. Because favor, unlike earned standing, was never yours to keep. And the person who gave it to you can, and eventually will, decide to take it back. Sometimes not out of malice, but simply because keeping you elevated has stopped serving them. Which brings us to the next lesson. How to tell the difference between someone who respects you and someone who is simply performing respect. The third truth is uncomfortable, but it will save you real pain if you learn it early. Not every compliment is connection. Some compliments are reconnaissance. Picture a manager who takes a new hire to coffee every other week. He asks about her weekend, remembers her sister's name, tells her she has an old soul, and sees things other people miss. It feels like mentorship. It feels like being known. What she doesn't notice, at first, is that every one of those conversations ends with her agreeing to take on something extra. Covering a shift, absorbing a project someone else dropped, defending a decision in a meeting she wasn't even part of. The warmth was real to her. Whether it was real to him is a different question entirely. Here's a second version, a little colder. A department head has a habit of finding one favorite per quarter, always the newest, most eager face on the team. He praises them extravagantly for the first few months, tells them things like, "You're the only one who actually gets what I'm trying to build here." Then, once they're fully dependent on his approval, fully willing to defend him in meetings, take on his overflow, cover for his mistakes, the intensity of the attention quietly fades, redirected toward the next new hire. The pattern repeats so cleanly that longtime employees can predict, almost to the month, who's about to become the favorite. This is one of the oldest observations in Machiavelli's entire body of work. The idea that charm and force are two separate tools, used by the same operator depending on which one gets better results. In The Prince, he writes that a ruler must know how to act as both man and beast, and specifically, must imitate the fox and the lion. The lion cannot defend against traps, and the fox cannot defend against wolves. You need the fox to recognize the traps, and the lion to frighten the wolves. Those who rely on the fox alone, he says, do not fully understand the game. The complement in this frame is fox behavior. It's not affection. It's the tool used before force becomes necessary. Because a person who feels admired rarely needs to be forced into anything. They volunteer. Why does this work so reliably on capable people specifically? Because competent, conscientious people are usually starved for recognition elsewhere. They've often spent years being told to stay humble, to not seek praise, to let the work speak for itself. When someone finally says, out loud, "I see how good you are," it lands with disproportionate force, precisely because it's rare. Manipulators know this. They're not targeting the weak link on the team. They're targeting the person whose hunger for recognition has gone quietly unfed the longest. So what's the actual test? Genuine respect tends to be demonstrated through consistency, the same tone whether you're useful that week or not, the same regard in your absence as in your presence. Calculated charm tends to spike around requests. Watch what happens right before and right after you're asked for something. Track it, literally, if you have to. Does the warmth correlate with what's being asked of you? Second, slow your compliance. A genuinely respectful superior can tolerate, "Let me think about that," without withdrawing warmth. A manipulative one gets subtly cooler the moment you don't immediately agree, because your usefulness was always the actual point. That instinct to test for consistency is going to matter even more in the next lesson, because it explains something that seems to make no sense at first. Why the very people who get the most praise are so often the first ones pushed out. Now we get to the part of this pattern that confuses almost everyone who lives through it. Why does the person who built you up so often become the same person who tears you down? It feels backwards. If they invested in you, shouldn't they want you to succeed? Here's the scenario. A rising analyst is mentored aggressively by his director for a year, pulled into strategy sessions, given credit publicly, told he has the sharpest instincts in the building. Then he does something that should be a triumph. He pitches an idea directly to the director's own boss, and it gets adopted and praised by name in a meeting the director wasn't even in. Within a month, the warmth is gone. Small errors that used to be waved off are suddenly written up. He's slowly excluded from the meetings that once defined his value. He did nothing disloyal. He simply became visible on his own, without needing the director to make him visible. And that, it turns out, was the one thing the relationship could not survive. A second version. An assistant is trained personally by a senior partner, given her exact templates, her exact way of framing arguments, told, "I'm building you to eventually run this the way I do." When a client, unprompted, requests to work with the assistant directly instead of the partner, the training stops overnight. Not because the assistant did anything wrong, because she had, without meaning to, demonstrated she no longer needed the very thing that made her useful to keep close: dependency. Machiavelli identified exactly this dynamic, though he was writing about states, not offices. In The Prince, discussing how the Venetians helped bring the French into Italy, he makes an observation that has outlived every specific example he used to illustrate it. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined himself. His point was blunt. When you build someone else up, you create a force you no longer fully control. And the moment that force can stand without you, your own position and your own leverage over them is what's actually at risk. Applied to a workplace, this explains the pattern precisely. Your growth wasn't a threat to the mentor's ego alone. It was a threat to the structure of dependency that made the relationship useful to them in the first place. Why does this trigger such a strong reaction in otherwise reasonable people? Because status is relative, and human beings track it constantly and mostly unconsciously. A mentor doesn't need to consciously think, "I must destroy my protege." It's often felt as a much smaller, quieter discomfort. A flicker of being outpaced, a fear of becoming replaceable. And that discomfort gets rationalized afterward into performance concerns or culture fit issues that appear, conveniently, right after the protege's independent success. So what do you do with this? First, recognize that outgrowing your mentor's usefulness to you is not disloyalty. It's the entire point of growth, and anyone who frames it otherwise is protecting their position, not yours. Second, when you succeed independently, manage the optics deliberately. Give credit generously, publicly, to the people who trained you, not because you owe them your success, but because visible gratitude costs you little and can diffuse a threat response you didn't intend to trigger. Third, and this is the harder one, accept that some relationships genuinely cannot survive your growth, and that this says something about the relationship's foundation, not about you, because the moment your usefulness shifts from dependent to independent, the same warmth that elevated you can turn, and it rarely turns slowly, which is exactly what the next lesson is about. Here's the fifth truth, and it's one that stings, because it means questioning something that felt completely genuine at the time. Loyalty that was purchased with attention, favor, or flattery was never loyalty at all. It was rent, and rent runs out. Picture the employee who defended her boss for years, in meetings, in hallway gossip, even to her own family when they asked why she stayed somewhere that clearly worked her too hard. She defended him because he'd been generous to her. The flexible hours when her kid was sick, the public praise, the sense that he got her in a way other managers never had. When budget cuts came and he had to choose who to protect, he protected someone else, someone with a more visible skill set, someone politically useful to keep. She was stunned. She'd given him years of loyalty. What she hadn't noticed was that the loyalty had only ever flowed one direction, sustained by a stream of small favors that could, and eventually did, stop. Here's a colder version. A team lead builds intense personal closeness with 2 or 3 inner circle employees, late-night messages, inside jokes, being told things like, "You're the only one I actually trust in this office." Those employees, in turn, cover for him constantly, defend him to HR, absorb blame that isn't theirs. When he's finally let go for performance issues that had been building for a year, not one of them is protected by the closeness they thought they had. The relationship, it turns out, existed to serve him. It evaporated the moment it stopped. Machiavelli wrote about exactly this fragility, and this is one of his most quoted lines for a reason. The bond of love is one which men, wretched creatures that they are, break when it is to their advantage to do so. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails. Read past the harshness of it, and there's a precise mechanical point being made. Love, including workplace loyalty built on favor, charm, and flattering attention, is maintained voluntarily by the person receiving the benefit of it for as long as it suits them. There is no cost to breaking it. Fear, in Machiavelli's cold framing, at least carries consequences for betrayal. Bought loyalty carries none. The moment it's inconvenient to keep favoring you or protecting you, or defending you, the bond simply dissolves, and nothing structural stops that from happening. Why do intelligent people fall for this repeatedly? Because reciprocity is one of the deepest instincts we have. When someone gives us something, we feel obligated to give back, and we assume, often wrongly, that the feeling runs both ways with equal weight. We remember the favors we received in vivid detail. The person who gave them, though, was often keeping a very different ledger, one measured in what our loyalty was worth to them, not what it cost us. Here's what to actually do. First, distinguish between favors given to you personally and structures that protect you regardless of anyone's personal feelings. Contracts, documented performance, formal titles, written policy. Personal favor can vanish overnight. Structural protection generally cannot. Second, notice if your loyalty to someone is based on what they've done for you, or on their actual character demonstrated under pressure, over time, to people who couldn't do anything for them. Third, never let gratitude for a past favor stop you from acting in your own interest today. The relationship, if it was ever truly reciprocal, will survive that. If it doesn't survive it, you'll have your answer about what it actually was. Which brings us to something that will feel, at first, contradictory to everything we've just said. Because sometimes the turn from favor to punishment doesn't trickle out slowly. It happens all at once, and understanding why it happens that way is the next lesson. Now to something that seems, on the surface, to contradict everything we've covered so far, because the fall, when it finally comes, almost never happens gradually. It happens fast, all at once. And that speed is not an accident. It's a technique. Consider the employee who had been the obvious favorite for over a year, praised in meetings, given the best projects, told directly by her manager that she was the future of this department. Then, over the course of exactly 9 days, everything changed. A performance improvement plan appeared. Her access to certain systems was quietly revoked. She was moved to a different desk, away from the team she'd led. By the second week, she was gone. Colleagues who'd watched her rise for a year were stunned at how quickly she fell. But the speed wasn't sloppiness. It was designed to prevent exactly what a slow removal invites: rallying support, building a case, gathering allies who might push back. A second version, less dramatic but just as calculated. A junior partner who'd been groomed for 2 years as next in line was informed in a 15-minute meeting that the firm was restructuring and his role was being eliminated, effective that Friday. No warning conversation, no gradual cooling. The relationship simply ended, cleanly, with legal language and a severance packet already printed. Machiavelli examined this exact principle when discussing rulers who seize power through violence, most famously in his account of Agathocles of Sicily. His conclusion was clinical. Cruelty, if it must happen, is used well when it is committed all at once for the sake of security and then not repeated, as opposed to cruelty used badly, which starts small and only grows worse over time. Applied outside the battlefield, the principle explains something that otherwise looks almost sadistic. The sudden, brutal efficiency of a professional downfall is often more strategically sound for the person delivering it than a long, dragged-out decline would be. A slow removal creates more opportunities for the target to build sympathy, gather evidence, or fight back. A fast one, however painful, minimizes exactly that risk. Why does this land so hard psychologically? Because human beings process sudden loss very differently from gradual loss. A slow decline gives the mind time to adjust its expectations bit by bit. A sudden one doesn't. It creates what's sometimes called a shattered assumption, the collapse of a belief you didn't even know you were resting on. In this case, the assumption that being valued meant being safe. That shock is often what people remember most vividly, more than the events leading up to it, because the nervous system doesn't distinguish well between "this was calculated" and "this was catastrophic." It just registers threat. So here's what actually helps. First, understand, before it happens, that speed is not proof of how little you mattered. It's frequently proof of how much the other side wanted to avoid a fight. That reframe alone protects you from a specific kind of self-blame that isn't warranted. Second, keep your own documentation current at all times, not reactively. Reviews, wins, written praise, precisely because you may not get warning before you need it. Third, build your financial and professional runway, assuming any position, however secure it feels, could end abruptly, not out of paranoia, but out of the same realism Machiavelli applied to power itself. Nothing that depends entirely on another person's continued goodwill is guaranteed, but speed only works as a strategy if the person using it can also maintain two faces long enough to choose the moment. Warm enough in public to avoid suspicion, cold enough in private to already be planning the exit. And that duality is exactly what the next lesson unpacks. The seventh truth is one that, once you see it, you can never really unsee again. The person who elevated you in public and dismantled you in private were never two different people making a mistake. They were one person performing two roles for two different audiences on purpose. Picture the manager who, in every team meeting, praises the culture he's built. Collaborative, supportive, we take care of our people here. In one-on-ones, though, with the very employee he praises loudest in public, the tone is different. Veiled comparisons to other hires, offhand comments about how replaceable certain roles are, subtle reminders of how much worse things could be. Colleagues who only see the public version genuinely believe he's a generous boss. Only the person on the receiving end of both versions knows the gap between them. Here's a second version. A senior leader is beloved company-wide for his openness. He does town halls, answers hard questions, is quoted internally as someone who really listens. Employees who've tried to raise a real concern with him privately describe something entirely different. A subtle chill, a redirect, a "let's take this offline" that never actually gets taken anywhere. Both versions of him are real in the sense that both are performed convincingly. Only one of them reflects what happens when there's nothing to be gained by performing. Machiavelli built an entire section of The Prince around exactly this gap between seeming and being. His line is one of the most enduring in the whole book. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few touch what you really are, and those few do not dare oppose the opinion of the many. He wasn't describing a flaw in human perception as an accident. He was describing it as one of the most exploitable features of how people evaluate character. Most colleagues, most of the time, only ever see the performed version of a person. The meetings, the town halls, the public praise. Very few ever see the private version, the one that only emerges when there's no audience left to perform for. And Machiavelli's darker point is this: even the few who do see through the performance often stay quiet, because contradicting the popular opinion of a well-liked, well-performed leader is socially costly, and most people would rather stay silent than be the one insisting the emperor has no clothes. Why is the gap so hard to prove, even to yourself? Because you start doubting your own perception. If everyone else experiences this person as warm and generous, and your private experience is cold and calculating, the natural conclusion your brain reaches for first is, "It must be me." That's not weakness. That's a completely predictable response to being the only data point that contradicts a widely held belief. So here's what actually helps. First, trust the pattern of your private experience over the volume of public opinion. Popularity is not evidence of character, it's evidence of successful performance, and those are not the same thing. Second, quietly find out if anyone else has a private version of this person that matches yours. You are very rarely actually the only one. You're usually just the only one who said it out loud. Third, stop trying to reconcile the public and private versions into one coherent person. You don't need to solve that contradiction. You just need to plan around the private version, because that's the one that will make the actual decisions about you. And once you can see clearly that you were dealing with a performance, not a person, the next question becomes urgent. How do you stop needing that performance to feel secure at all? That's what the next lesson is built around. Here is the 8th truth, and it's the most practical one in this entire video, because it's the one thing that actually would have changed every story we've told so far. None of these people were destroyed because they lacked talent. They were destroyed because their entire position depended on someone else's continued goodwill, and they had built nothing of their own to stand on if that goodwill disappeared. Think about the employee whose entire professional identity, after 2 years, was the boss's right hand. Every project ran through him. Every important conversation happened because he was in the room the boss wanted him in. He had, without meaning to, let his actual skills become invisible, folded entirely into someone else's authority. When the boss was pushed out in a reorganization 8 months later, no one above them knew what the employee himself was actually capable of, because he'd never had to demonstrate it independently. He'd only ever demonstrated loyalty. A second version. A rising employee spent 3 years being groomed as the heir apparent to a department head, absorbing his style, his contacts, his way of pitching ideas so completely that colleagues started calling her Mini-him. When the department head left for a competitor, she assumed she'd be the natural successor. Instead, leadership brought in someone external, because internally, she wasn't seen as her own person with her own track record. She was seen as an extension of someone who just left. Machiavelli returns to this exact structural weakness again and again throughout The Prince, most memorably in his specific of what separates rulers who last from rulers who don't. All armed prophets have conquered, and unarmed ones have been destroyed. His argument was that even the most brilliant vision, the most persuasive message, the most talented individual fails the moment it depends entirely on someone else's continued protection rather than its own independent strength. Those who tried to introduce new ideas or new order relying purely on persuasion with no independent standing of their own to fall back on were consistently destroyed the moment the wind changed. Applied to a career, the lesson is blunt. Your talent, your work, your reputation, these need to exist as your own independent strength, verifiable and visible apart from whichever single person currently controls your access to opportunity. Why do so many capable people skip this step? Because building independent standing is slower and less immediately rewarding than accepting the fast track someone powerful offers you. It also often feels ungrateful, as though building your own reputation outside your mentor's shadow is a kind of betrayal of the relationship that got you there in the first place. That discomfort is worth sitting with rather than obeying, because the alternative, as we've seen across every lesson so far, is a position that only exists for as long as someone else decides to keep it existing. So, concretely, first, make sure some meaningful portion of your work is visible and attributable to you specifically, not filtered entirely through whoever currently sponsors you. Present your own results in your own voice wherever you can. Second, build a track record that would mean something, even in a room your current sponsor has never entered. Documented outcomes, relationships with people who evaluated your work directly, rather than hearing about it secondhand. Third, treat every position of dependency as temporary by design, not as a failure of the relationship. Build your independent footing while things are still good, because that's exactly the moment when it's hardest to feel necessary and easiest to skip. Because standing on your own, in this sense, isn't about aggression. It's about the simple, unglamorous fact that no one can dismantle what you've built independently, only what you allowed to exist solely at their discretion. Which brings us to the final lesson, what it actually looks like to walk away from all of this with more than you had before it started. And that brings us to the 9th and final truth, the one that actually matters more than understanding the trap itself. What you do with what's left after it's over. Picture the employee we started with, the one who was praised, elevated, made to feel like the future of the company, then quietly dismantled once she stopped being useful to keep dependent. 2 years later, she's rebuilt her career somewhere else. But she carries something the old version of her didn't have. She no longer needs a single person's approval to know her own value. She measures herself now by her own standard of work, documented and demonstrable, not by whether someone with more power than her happens to be smiling that week. That shift, from needing to be told you matter to simply knowing your own worth, independent of anyone's opinion, is the actual prize hidden inside everything we've covered. Consider the mentee who was groomed, then discarded, when he started outgrowing his mentor's need to control him. A year later, he's leading his own team, and the strange thing he notices is that he no longer performs for approval in meetings the way he used to. He states his position, he lets the work speak, and if someone disagrees, he doesn't spiral the way he once did when his old boss's mood shifted. He built, without fully realizing it, an internal sense of standing that no external favor gave him and no external withdrawal can take away. Machiavelli, writing in the Discourses on Livy this time rather than the Prince, made an observation that reframes everything we've discussed. It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles. His point, in context, was about leadership in the Roman Republic, that a position of authority is only as respectable as the person who holds it, not the other way around. Applied here, the implication flips the entire trap on its head. The golden child status, the corner office, the public praise, none of it was ever the source of your worth. It was, at best, a temporary reflection of it, granted by someone with the power to grant it, and just as easily withdrawn. Your worth was never actually theirs to give you in the first place, which means it was never actually theirs to take away either. Why does this reframe matter so much practically? Because as long as your sense of value depends on someone else's continued approval, you remain controllable by whoever currently holds that approval. That's not a character flaw. It's simply how the mechanism works on anyone in any hierarchy. The only real exit from the entire cycle we've spent this video describing isn't a clever countermove against a manipulative boss. It's building a self-assessment sturdy enough that no one else's opinion, however elevated or however cruel, can move it very far in either direction. So, concretely, as we close, first, write down, honestly, what you actually believe you're good at, independent of any boss's opinion, past or present, and revisit that list whenever someone else's approval or disapproval starts to feel like the whole truth about you. Second, seek feedback going forward from multiple, structurally independent sources, not just the one person who currently controls your career. Because a single source of truth about your value is exactly the vulnerability this entire pattern exploits. Third, remember that recognizing this pattern doesn't make you cynical. It makes you accurate. Understanding that praise can be strategic doesn't mean all praise is fake. It means you now know how to tell the difference, which is a far more valuable skill than blind trust ever was. So let's bring it together. You were elevated, and the elevation felt personal, but it was often a leash built on ground that was never yours, offered by someone using charm the way a fox uses cunning, right up until your own growth made you look, to them, like a threat instead of an asset. The bond, when it was tested, turned out to be rented, not owned. And when it broke fast, on purpose, behind a public face that never matched the private one. The only real defense against all of it was never outsmarting the person doing it. It was building something of your own, independent standing, independent worth, that no one else's favor could grant you, and no one else's cruelty could take away. Out of everything we covered tonight, which one hit closest to home for you? The gilded leash, the sudden fall, or the fox behind the compliment? Tell me in the comments, because chances are, if it happened to you, it's happening to someone else in your comments section right now. And they need to hear that they weren't imagining it either. If this video helped you make sense of something that happened to you, or something happening to you right now, subscribe, because we break down one of these patterns every week, always through the same lens. Not to teach you to manipulate anyone, but to make sure you're never the only person in the room who doesn't understand the game being played. Stay strategic, stay grounded, stay impossible to quietly discard. I'll see you in the next one.